Hi everybody, welcome to week 8. And during this week we're going to talk about difficulties in collaboration. And this week is a little bit of a transition week. You'll notice I have 2 readings for you, and I call them both case studies. One is more a case study than the other, but they both present, they each present, I should say, some difficulties in collaboration in 2 different worlds. One involves a case study on the city of Toronto, Ontario, and the other involves difficulties in the, let's say, the emergency management community in dealing with different forms of command and control. But they both present some study and contrast in how collaboration can be difficult. And you know, we reviewed that article by Agronoff about the 10 lessons, and the reason I had you do that is because the point that Agronoff makes, I think, is that a lot of people would see networking as something like a magic solution, a panacea. And in fact, it's not. There are a lot of difficulties in collaboration. And it's important for us to recognize that, especially in the context of what we've been talking about early on in the course, that context of intergovernmental management. So let's move into that for this week. Upcoming. Yeah, I just want to emphasize this one more time. Next week, not this coming week, this is week 8, but beginning on July 10th, we start with week 9. And week 9 is a 3-week unit where you're going to specialize. So what I'm asking everybody to do is affirmatively advise me on your selection of track, and I'd like you to do that on your discussion posts this week. Just the first sentence, say, hey, by the way, my track is emergency management or healthcare or whatever, and just do that so that your classmates can see. The reason I'm doing that is because I plan on using actually some collaborative approaches to the discussion during those 3 weeks. Within each group, I'm going to ask for some collaboration between classmates. So that's the reason I need to know what group you're in. A couple of you have advised me by email already, but please go ahead, everybody, and just do that in the discussion this week so that I know. The other thing that you'll notice in the discussion this week is it's delayed for a day because of the July 4th holiday. And so your initial discussion will be due Thursday night, and response discussions due Saturday night. So also, just as a reminder, reading reflection number 3 is coming up on July 16th and number 4 on July 30th. And again, on those, I'm going to give you the option of writing on your choice of readings within your track. Talked about the term project a lot last week. I don't really want to go into more detail this week, but if you do have questions, please do email them to me as soon as you have your question. Don't wait until a couple days before it's due, please. That really puts you under stress, and me as well. So this week I had to read these 2 case studies. One is by Bramwell. It's called Who Speaks for Toronto? And as she says, this is a case study on the formation, consolidation, and evolution of the Greater Toronto Civic Action Alliance, a durable and high-performing collaborative governance regime operating in a politically fragmented, socially diverse, and geographically large city region. And unless I miss my guess, I believe this study was part of her doctoral dissertation. And the other is from Waugh, called Mechanisms for Collaboration in Emergency Management, ICS, NIMS, and the Problem with Command and Control. And so what Waugh is talking about, he says that post 9/11, relationships between emergency management agencies at all levels of government and non-governmental organizations on which they depend for support changed as national security concerns reduced the transparency of decision-making processes and the openness to partnerships and other forms of collaboration. So anyway, why is this so? And what are some of the problems that we can pick out in terms of collaboration in both the case of Toronto and in the case of disagreements on command and control for emergency management. So, in the Bramwell article on Toronto, here's what she says. She says weak ties with municipal politicians and conflict over the question of who speaks for Toronto have important implications for understanding the prospects for cross-boundary collaboration in cities. So she talks about challenges of scale, scope, and governance. This is a great case study because Toronto, a lot of Americans don't think about this, but Toronto really is the fourth largest metro area in North America. So, basically Toronto is Canada's New York City. It is a very large metro area. There are actually large cities in and of themselves, like Hamilton, Ontario, within the metro area of Toronto. And so it's very challenging in terms of the scope of this problem. She identified policy gaps between governments. She identified issues in leadership selection. She identified issues in agenda setting, in capacity, in measuring results, and in the representativeness of the network itself. So these are all problems that she identified as this collaborative governance regime, this CGR, was being formed and as it operated over a period of about a decade. Let's switch to the Waugh article. What kinds of things was Waugh identifying? Well, Waugh, for those of you in emergency management, all this stuff is kind of old hat to you, but for everybody else, it might not be. He was really talking about the difference between something called the Incident Command System, ICS, the Multi-Agency Coordination System, or MACS, and the Unified Command System, or basically the National Incident Management System, or NIMS. And so really what he's talking about is sort of the difference of philosophy between these approaches to managing an emergency situation. So for full disclosure, I actually in the military a few years ago, I was trained in the Incident Command System, where a commander directs operations at a disaster scene from either an incident command post, which might be just standing at the scene, or an actual building command post. And so that commander actually has command and control of the incident. And what Waugh talks about is this is still very popular in fire services. So this is actually the model that fire departments nationwide often prefer to use. There is a fire chief in charge of a fire, for example, and there is a senior fire, that is the senior fire chief or the commander, and everyone else reports to this commander. So it's a top-down directed command and control system. On the far right, the Unified Command System, NIMS, provides mechanism for multiple jurisdictions to coordinate support. So there's an emergency operations center supporting collaborative decision processes. And then in the middle, the multi-agency coordination system, agency or government representatives coordinate resources and support operations, and there's often regional coordination. So these are just different approaches to collaboration and command and control of emergency management. And what he talks about in the article is how these three systems may or may not line up with each other and the difficulties in actually implementing one or the other. So some problems that Waugh identified. Post 9/11, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, terrorism became the primary hazard for a lot of the emergency management community. Even though, it's actually a fact that terrorism incidents, as horrible as they are actually the minority of emergency management situations. And so there was this loss of this philosophy of the all hazards expertise, training for natural disasters, human-made disasters, and others. And so this led to a morphing of the role of local emergency managers. Waugh points to in the article the idea that different command and control systems actually might work better in different circumstances. There really might not be a one-size-fits-all kind of command and control system. He talks about the ability to improvise, a management skill, and he also talks about the ability to coordinate between jurisdictions. And so what I did on the next couple slides is I wanted really, in general, to take these two articles and I wanted to pick out some factors that affect collaboration. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, and I mentioned this in the discussion post for this week, I didn't identify all of them, and I'm hoping that all of you can go into the articles, dig deeper, and find factors that you find in common that might actually present difficulties in intergovernmental collaboration or intergovernmental and intersectoral collaboration within, within the public service area that you work or in others that you can think of. But I identified a few factors that I thought presented difficulties in collaboration. And the first that I came up with was jurisdictions. And you all know this because you're MPA students, but there's in the United States alone, there are over 89,000 governments. People like to talk about the government as if there were one large monolithic government in the United States, and that's simply not the case. Now, some of these governments are quite small. They may be library districts, for example, but some are quite substantial. School districts have quite a bit of influence in certain areas in states and cities, even though they don't, for example, own a police or fire department. I believe there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 17,000 separate police jurisdictions in the United States, and around that many fire jurisdictions in the United States. So you can start seeing that jurisdictional issues can become a problem in collaboration. The second one I came up with was monetary and funding incentives. I found it interesting in the Waugh article that post 9/11, one of the ways that local jurisdictions could actually get more grant money was to identify agencies, sub-agencies, or even specialists as first responders, so that if your emergency management staff, if you were able to say they are first responders, you might actually gain more grant money. So there's this incentive issue. Does this cause problems in collaboration between agencies? It could, because we're talking about how we define terms. And then there are interests. So I thought the Toronto case was very interesting because we see differences in interest between the business community in the Toronto metro, the arts community, immigrant communities, local governments, of which there are many in the Toronto metro, and even the national government of Canada, as well as the provincial government of Ontario. So each of these have separate interests. Do these cause problems in networked governance? And then power. I think Waugh does a great job of talking about how the National Incident Management System has been and is imposed on local jurisdictions. And at least one student is writing on this in their project. And does this present a problem when the national government is imposing a system on local jurisdictions and at the same time asking for collaboration? Who has more power? You can translate this to any kind of networked governance issue, and that is who carries official power and who carries unofficial power within the network. Sometimes it's difficult to decipher that. A couple more, and I'm going to actually go into length on the second one, culture, but organizational histories. So when we think about history, how does this affect what goes on in a network? The Department of Homeland Security really was a department formed from actually consolidating a lot of departments in the federal government into one. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, predates the Department of Homeland Security. The Coast Guard, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security, predates the department itself. And so the Department of Homeland Security doesn't necessarily have one organizational history. In fact, it doesn't at all. And even the military, which I'm more familiar with, we came from a two service mentality in the Constitution. There was an Army and there was a Navy, and there were actually distinct reasons for having a separate Army and a separate Navy. Now we have a Department of Defense composed of at least 4 services. And oh, by the way, the Coast Guard sometimes becomes part of the Department of Defense, even though it's in the Department of Homeland Security. It's in a matrix sort of way. And so it's, these organizational histories actually provide a lot of fodder for misunderstanding when we're trying to accomplish things in networks. And you can even think, in terms of trying for collaboration at a local level in a city. How do the histories of various cities in a metro area, how do those bump into each other? And even histories of specialist kind of regimes. So Waugh uses the example of firefighting. The firefighting community actually is sort of a quasi-military kind of organization, and it has firefighters look to and recognize sort of a special history all their own. So how does that bump into the effort at collaboration? And then finally, culture. So my big question, overriding question, is what happens when individuals, national culture, and organizational culture crash into one another? So this isn't the 80-90 class, but I think maybe you all took 80-90, and you probably have looked at this book in your undergraduate or graduate careers, the book by Hofstede and Hofstede called Cultures and Organizations, subtitled, I think, Software of the Mind. And so, they're mostly talking about national cultures, and they do devote some space to organizational cultures. But they're mostly talking about national cultures and why it's important, really, for all of us to understand cultural differences. And I kind of think there are more cultures, obviously, than national cultures, but how does culture actually affect our ability to work collaboratively? So they draw this model of the individual. That the individual, all of us, we're composed of something we call human nature, and then the next level is culture, and the next level is personality. And so on the left side, we see, this argument between, is this universal or is it something we learn? So this is kind of the argument that we, usually term nature versus nurture, right? So my nature as a human, is there such a thing as a universal human nature? And actually, when it comes to belief, there are a lot of people who have this belief that yes, indeed, there is sort of this core set of universal things that define humanness. Other people would say, no, everything is inherited, from our parents or from our environment. Somewhere in the middle is where a lot of people fall down. Same with our culture. Is our culture unique or specific to a group or a category? Is there an American culture that we have because we are Americans? Is there an African American culture? Is there an Asian American culture that might even be distinct from African culture or Asian culture? Is it learned? And how do we learn it? And then our personalities. Is my personality something that is in my DNA somehow? Or is it something that I inherited and learned? And so again, psychologists basically ask that question, and they're still asking that question. And and again, a lot of us basically say, yeah, I think it's somewhere in the middle. But the fact of the matter is, we are all unique individuals, and however we came upon this personality that we carry around with us, when we get into an organization, we are all unique individuals. And then they go further, and this familiar target diagram, I think you've probably all seen before, this manifestations of culture and different levels of depth. This really is referring to national culture. And in the study, in the book, this diagram here really outlines what they talk about for most of the rest of the book. But what they say, this is what we see when we talk about culture. This isn't the culture itself, but this is what we see. Every culture, for example, has symbols. So, for example, there has always been, and it ebbs and flows, but there's always this argument about, for example, flag burning. Should it be illegal to burn the American flag? Is it an act of free speech, or is it basically a slap in the face of our national culture? And so the flag itself is a symbol. And then there's heroes, right? So in our culture, we revere certain people. This is not to say everyone reveres them, but it's part of our larger mythology. Abraham Lincoln. So, for example, when people visit Washington, D.C., lots of times they go to the Lincoln Monument. And if you go to the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., you will see people from all over the world at the Lincoln Memorial. And there he is, this larger-than-life white granite hero of the United States. And you can read on one wall the Gettysburg Address, and on the other wall you can read his second inaugural address. And so this is part of our larger national myth. Lincoln as, the person who saved the Union. And then there are rituals. And so it is July 4th weekend. And actually, I backed off the assignment for week 7 and delayed the discussion for week 8 because I know on Monday we're all going to be celebrating the 4th of July. We're going to be going to fireworks shows, or we're going to be having a picnic with our families. Those are rituals. And then values, really, what are the things that we believe, right? So what are the things we believe about democracy? What are the things we believe about separation of powers? What are the things we believe about limited government? Or what are the things we believe about the relationships between levels of government? And often we don't even think about those things, those values, those things we believe. But all of these things translate into the practices, and the practices that we have as Americans, for example, or as an organization, cut through all these things and are based on all these things. And then finally in the book, Hofstede and Hofstede do talk about organizational culture, but they don't, they talk about it not a lot. They say that basically, it's trendy to talk about organizational culture, but they're not real sure what it necessarily means. But they do identify 6 possible dimensions of organizational culture. And these are process-oriented versus results-oriented. Employee-oriented versus job-oriented, parochial versus professional, open system versus closed system, loose control versus tight control, and normative versus pragmatic. And so you can stereotypically think of organizations and you can say, oh yes, this is how we would define this organizational culture. So again, a police department may have, you may stereotypically think of a police department having tight control. However, a lot of recent things that have happened with police departments might convince you that in fact some police departments don't have as tight a control over their officers as they ought to have. Normative versus pragmatic. So for example, think of the hospital system. There are protocols in hospitals that providers are supposed to follow for patients. Of course they use their judgment, but they have protocols for certain health situations regarding patients. For example, a do not resuscitate order is the request from a patient in a particular terminal state not to resuscitate them if they go into cardiac arrest. But that's based on a protocol, and it's based on it's not just, gee, what should we do? This person looks like they're dying. It's actually a normative protocol that's been established and used. So there are these elements of organizational culture that are present within organizations. Now, here's the question. So what happens when national cultures, group identities, individual backgrounds, and organizational cultures crash into each other in the process of collaboration? That's really this overriding question that I have about collaboration. Going back to the 10 lessons reading, we can't think of collaboration as this panacea that fixes everything, that fixes every problem, for example, that we might have in local government. Gosh, if the local government can't do it, let's just network and we should be able to fix everything. That, that idea is something that Agronoff says is really a false economy. So for the discussion this week is the first question there. So from either the factors discussed in the lecture or factors you identify in the 2 assigned readings, and again, I did not identify all of them, discuss 3 factors that make intergovernmental or intersectoral collaboration and networking more difficult. And let us all know why that is. So again, the point of this week is to really get a hold of and really reiterate some of these problems we have with intergovernmental collaboration, what does make it difficult, and why networking might not be as easy as people think. So that's it for this week. By the time you hear this lecture, probably your reading reflections are turned in. Please do let me know which group you plan on being in, and then we'll look forward to a little more collaboration within groups for the 3 weeks following this. Thanks very much.